Hi, so let's start with Spring Security. Here I have the Spring Security architecture type. This is a user, and the first layer which comes in Spring Security is our authentication filter. Authentication filter contains a lot of, we can have a lot of many authentication filters. For example, one for checking the course policy, one for checking the JWT authentication, one for basic authentication. And yeah, like that, we can have many filters. After which we have authentication manager. Authentication manager is the one which manages authentication providers. So authentication provider, there can be multiple authentication providers based on your requirement. For example, you can have authentication provider for JWT authentication, one for basic authentication. Basic authentication usually means just checking the username and password. JWT authentication, we are checking for the tokens based on the previous basic authentication that has happened. So like that we can have. And then, so yeah, authentication manager manages them. So it will decide which authentication provider should be called when the request comes. Then we have user details service. So this service is the one which returns the object, which returns the user details object. User details object will contain all the information about the user. For example, the authorities that the user has, as well as username, password, as well as whether the account has expired or not, or whether the credentials has expired or not, and all of those. Yeah, and then we have the password encoder. Password encoder, as the name suggests, it will just encode the password, and this is help. This will help in the security of our password. So, this will provide an extra layer of security. And after this, if we are able to load the user from the database, we match authentication provider. In authentication provider, we will match whether the user details and the password, whether they match the one which we have in our database, and then we will pass it to authentication manager if it is success, and then authentication filter. Authentication filter will, if the authentication is successful, authentication filter will store this user's session into the security context so that you don't have so that the user's data would be persisted in the whole flow of our app for that particular user. This is the architectural diagram. Let's start with including it in our application. Say let's write and then demo. For dependencies, we need security, and for REST, the web dependency. And yeah, let's generate store it, and then let's open it. So I do have it open with the same dependencies. If you go over here, you can see Spring Boot Starter Security, Spring Boot Starter Web. Let's start with creating a controller. Let's say a demo controller. And in this, we annotate it with test control. And let's provide a request mapping for this demo. And this will have public Spring return method. Say return this just returns. No. Let's annotate it with get mapping slash hello. Yeah, this one should do. Then application properties, let's provide for. Okay, let's start. Let's try to start the application. Okay, so our application has started, and you see using generated security password. So Spring Security, whenever we add this dependency, Spring Security provides us a password with the help of which we can access the endpoint. So this password will be useful for us whenever we are trying to access any endpoints. And the default username for this for accessing it would be user. So let's try to access this demo slash has slash hello. Yeah, demo slash hello. In this, we are presented with a login form. Let's provide some, let's say, dummy user and password instead of the one which is provided by security, and it says back credentials. So yes, this does provide one layer of security to our application. And let's say now let's try to put the correct password. And yeah, so it is our method. We are able to access this point. That's a good thing. But you generally won't be doing this in our. This is good for demo, but you generally won't be doing it for your production or maybe or anywhere. This is not good. This is not a good way to configure Spring security. For that, as we said, as I showed you in this diagram, we need to provide user details service, password encoder, and a user details object with the and our authentication provider will use that user details service which we have created instead of the default one. For this to happen, we have to create a user details with a user details object and provide it to the user details. Let's do that. Let's create user storage. Okay. This we need to implement the case. Now, you go inside this user details, you'll see a lot of methods. One is get authorities. So this will give us the authorities that the user has or the permissions that the user has. For example, let's say whether he has a read permission for that endpoint or not, whether he has a write access or not, like those. Then we have password. We have a method to get the password, get the username. Then is account non-expired? So this will tell us whether the account is not expired or not. So you can configure logic in your project so as to make the account as expired. For example, if the user has explicitly deleted his account from the application. Then we have as account non-lock. So let's say you provide a logic in your application to lock a user if 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 he does let's say multiple invalid attempts to log in, then we can make this account as locked. Is credentials non-expired? So this is the one which will check whether the credentials has not expired or not. We can hard code it every time to send it as proof that the credentials are not expired. But you can configure it. You can implement it to provide a logic so as to make the credentials as expired and ask the user to create new credentials. Is enabled as the name suggests whether the account is enabled for that user. Now let's implement those methods for us. For now, let's hard code it. Instead of hard coding, you can always use a database to get the user and then build a user details object and then provide it to the user details service. But for this session, let's hard code it. Let's say I provide read permission for that user. For password, let's say we provide password. The name, let's say the one which is default. For now, let's hard code them to everything. And is enabled. Now we have to pass this user key security to our user service so that our authentication provider would be able to fetch it. For that, let's create user details service of our own. Let's implement the service. If you go inside this class, inside this interface, you'll see only one method, load user by username, which takes the username and user detail, and it returns user details. So since we have implemented the details object over here, we will return this one. And for implementing, let's implement that method. Then return your security object. It's annotated with @component so that our authentication provider, this one, it will fetch our custom user details service instead of the default user details service. And since we have provided user details security to be returned from our load user by usernames, giving this will be returning this object, that is, this is the username, this is the password, and our authentication provider will validate it whether the username and password which we are providing from the login form, it matches with the ones that are here. If it matches, it provides a successful return, and then authentication manager will provide it to authentication filter, and then we can store it in security context. For now, we have implemented this much. And okay, let's try to restart. This will definitely give us an exception. Nothing good happens. We do not have any. Let's wait to see what exception comes. Okay, so if you see, our application has started, and if you see now, you do not see the default password it was being provided. So this is because of UserDetailsService security, which we have provided the implementation. Now let's try to access our endpoint. Okay, we get the login form. Now we'll provide the username password that we have configured, but if you see, it gives nothing. It says nothing. Let's check if we have got any. And yes, there is. It says there is no password encoder for the ID. So this means whenever we are defining our own user detail service, we have to define password encoder. Now let's define our password encoders. For that, let's create theme for it. And let's annotate it with configuration because we will be defining these. Bean public password encoder. Then let's return the default one, which is used by default. That is, whenever we do not define our custom user detail service. The one which is used by default is return no ops password. Perfect. So what this does is nothing. To be honest, this does nothing. Whatever password we have entered, it will just use it. It won't do anything. It won't modify it. It won't encode it. It won't do anything. It will just return it as it is to our authentication provider to validate it. That's all. So now, since we have the defined password encoder, let's see if it works or not. Okay, so our application has started. We see that there are no exceptions as such. Let's try to access our demo/hello form. Yeah, the login form again. Let's say we provide an invalid password. Sign in there. Wait, that user and the password, that is password. Try to sign in. it does that. Great. Okay, so that's all for today. We have configured our own password encoder. I mean, we have defined our own password encoder. We have defined our user detail service. We have defined our own user detail. Yes, this much we have configured. In next sessions, we'll create our own authentication providers and authentication filters, and then we use this authentication manager to use the correct provider. And also we'll discuss how we can use the security. That's all.